So welcome everybody. I'm really pleased you could come and celebrate the launch of this fabulous book, if I say so myself. A project that's been dear to my heart that I've been working on for a number of years. I want to give a shout out first to Julie Saul, who introduced me to Berthe and started me on this wonderful odyssey. Also Michelle Chochi of the David Berg Foundation, who gave us initial funding to launch our research into this underknown figure. And I'm really thrilled that we'll be able to now make accessible this remarkable memoir that was written in 1933. So I thought I would start with a very quick slide presentation because lots of us don't know who, or many don't know who Berthe is. Here's a portrait of her by Pablo Picasso, who remained a lifelong friend. And one of her many achievements is that she was the very first dealer to not only promote emerging artists, but also to sell works by Picasso. So he was 19 when she sold his first works. And we're working on an exhibition that is now scheduled to open at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts and then open at the Grey Art Gallery in 2024, then travel to the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, and we're hoping to announce a Parisian venue soon. So Berthe was born in 1865. She was the fifth child out of a family of 7. A very poor family. She was born in the first arrondissement in Paris. Her father was a négociant or a rag picker. Her mother was a seamstress. Because she was a sickly child, she was sent to be the apprentice in an art dealer's shop. A fellow named Salvatore Mayer, whose antique shop was located on Rue Lafitte, which was the street where all the galleries were located. And a lot of his clients were Impressionist artists and artists around the late 1890s, 1900, who would love to come and browse through the various pictures and prints that he assembled. Here are the 4 locations of Berthe's shop. I think what's remarkable also is even though she was underfinanced and had to struggle every month to pay the rent, she kept her gallery going from 1901 to 1941, which Jeanne is not a bad run. So in her very first exhibition in 1901, she includes a sculpture by an African-American sculptor named Meta Warwick, whose image is on the left, who was the protege of Rodin. And I chose another work by Samuel Halpert, an American artist that she showed, who happens to also be the husband of Edith Halpert, so that's a nice little note to do. These are 2 of Picasso's paintings that she sold. Hopefully everybody recognizes the Moulin de la Galette, which is of course in the Guggenheim, and the Chambre Bleue, which is at the Phillips Collection. These are some other works from the very first exhibition in 1901. Launay, Fabien Launay died pretty young, the first time Mayol ever showed in a commercial gallery. And then 2 jewelry from Paco Durio. She was the first to show Matisse in a commercial gallery. So we have a very early Matisse on the left, one of ones that we're pretty sure went through the gallery, as well as a Zobel. So this is an artist who was new to me when I started researching. It's a Hungarian artist who was very much of the Fauve family. And he's done some terrific works. So he was an artist I was glad to learn about. Berthe gave Diego Rivera his first show in Paris in 1914. The other remarkable thing about Berthe was she did catalogs for all the artists, all the shows. So in the first years, you might remember from the previous slide, she would only organize about 4 art shows. She produced catalogs for them. She would also sell prints and posters and the drawings for the many magazines that were produced at the time.
And books.
And books. She loved books, and a couple of times she had to sell her book collection.
That's when she really cries, is how poor she is. She had to sell
her
books.
book collection. She's maybe most well known for having given Modigliani his very first solo show, and the only show that he received during his lifetime. He died a year or two after the show. And here's the catalog, and you'll see there's the 4 red arrows pointing to the nudes that we know well. It turns out that Bert's show was across the street from the police commissioner, and he shut it down because he decided that they were obscene because they showed pubic hair. She was the first to show Suzanne Valadon, as well as Valadon's son Utrillo. And she also supported, in addition to Valadon, she supported a lot of women artists. This is an artist named Emily Charmy, who also showed early on with the Fauve artists. And Charmy became one of her most loyal artists. Alice Alika was another woman artist I was happy to meet. And you can see here she has this wonderful Cubist work from 1915. And then, of course, what's fun in reading Power are all the parties and the openings and the vernissage and the comings and goings of the French art world. So this was the 25th anniversary of the Galerie B. So I should say that they can be pronounced 3 ways: Weill, Veil, or they. The family chose they, with the silent 2 L's at the end. And she was known as La Petite Merveille, which is a play on words as the small wonder, the small marvelous, because she was 5 feet tall. She is there in the back, you can see, she's not towering above. So on the left is the very first, the cover of the first edition that came out in '33. And you can see how the contemporary designer took inspiration from the original cover. What's interesting is I had always thought that Vollard's much more well-known Recollections of a Picture Dealer was the first memoir of an art dealer, and I have a copy from graduate school days. So I was surprised to learn that Berthe beat him to the punch, and then there's actually a more complicated story with Vollard, who was also a great competitor. Vollard actually learned the business of art dealing in Salvatore Mayer's shop. He hung around and listened and talks very positively about Salvatore Mayer. And then the French version was published in 1937. This is portraits of Berthe. She was described as homely, and John Richardson, who wrote the Picasso biography, says that she wore glasses as thick as fish bowls. However, we've learned that's not the case. There were lorgnettes that just rested, I think you can see in the upper left. But she was definitely short in stature. And I think one of my favorite anecdotes, which is recounted by Marianne de Morvan in the introduction to the book, is that we don't know how she survived deportation. She seems to have been hiding in place in Paris in the 40s when the Germans occupied France, and she emerges penniless. And all the artists she had given the first shows to or had supported got together in 1946 and held a benefit auction for her, which is incredibly touching. So in 1946, they were able to raise $130,000 that was able to sustain her for the last 5 years of her life. She dies in 1951. And just, a reminder that the art world at that time was predominantly men, and predominantly men from privileged backgrounds. So she was a real anomaly. We think she's one of the first major women dealers. And she certainly is the first woman dealer who had such a long tenure. So I think I'll leave these images up and start with Jeanne, maybe, asking her about what struck her when she read the memoir, as she is obviously an art dealer as well.
So it's a wonderful book, and your introduction is really terrific as well. You know, some of the enduring things about art dealers is that we all love our books, and we also always buy more than we can afford, and it's just it's chronic, and so that is something that was, you know, a similarity. You know, the book is full of this moment in our history where there is a struggle or a kind of a moment where she's constantly referring to her young artists, les jeunes, and her antique business, her postcard business, her business that really actually kept her going, and it's this, you know, imagine seeing a shop filled with antiques, and then one day she completely gets rid of everything and turns it into a gallery for emerging artists. It was very courageous of her, and it was clearly led by passion as well. So that also struck me. But she's constantly referring in the book to having to return to her antiques and postcards.
Yes, I mean, at one point, especially I think during the war, she also started serving meals for a franc to artists who needed to eat. I mean, she was
scrappy.
She was.
She was really scrappy. I mean, you know, one thing that you didn't touch on that I was kind of hoping to ask you, you know, she never marries. She gets in a fight with her mother and father about not getting married. She first actually has her brother working with her, and then he goes off and gets married. And she shows a lot of women artists. She at some point says in the book, "Oh, I really don't like women, you know, in that way." And I thought that was a really interesting moment where she says it. So I'm wondering, because you gone deep. Did she have a lover?
She is very private about her private life. She doesn't reveal much, and this is something that William Rodivar notes in his translator's note. We think she probably was gay. She talks about France, Mademoiselle V, or she goes by acronyms. She tries, I think she had a very strong personality. She did dress in men's clothes at some of these parties and costume parties, but we don't know for sure. And the family themselves, the niece who I've spoken with, is not, you know, they don't really address the topic, but she did support women artists. She was very good friends with Emily Charmy, as I said, but Emily Charmy was married and, you know, had a family. So that there's still a lot of things that we don't know.
Right, and then just one other thing that really struck me, as an art dealer who has never had kind of this hierarchy between paintings and sculpture. You know, the Maillot that you showed is actually a ceramic sculpture. She showed jewelry. She was incredibly open in terms of what she was willing to put in her shop, and I'm sure she kind of inherited that from the antique business. But I thought that was really wonderful.
No, I think it's great, and she really did supplement. There is a really supporter of all artists, including the graphic artists who, you know, illustrated the many journals, as I mentioned. Carlo, you were on this scene in the downtown scene, which was a similar time of a lot of artistic ferment, a lot of young artists moving to New York to try and make their name. What resonated for you in reading?
Yeah,
this?
I mean, Jeanne points it out well. This phrase, les jeunes, it's not coded with all aspects. She doesn't refer to them by any movement. She doesn't even call them the modernists, right? It's like, it's kind of before that, and I think a lot of us probably have a similar experience where when people arrive at the art world as young artists or as whatever artwork they're going to do, the table's pretty full. The generation before you, they all got a seat, they're all eating pretty good, and they're not really about to give up their seat. And so every generation kind of has to find a way to break through. And you really kind of feel that maybe they're going, obviously it would be against the Academy as well, where, we think of where Impressionism, where early modernism would be opposed to that, but basically you have this sense. So I think you can really relate to that, but I mean, she's just got such a beguiling voice, and so you kind of like fall in love with that or with her in that way. I mean, she's fierce, but like with this kind of stubborn frailty, which is just really wonderful. It's this, her kind of persistence on this level of subsistence, this bare level of it, is just like, it's really dramatic. And she's got a really good bullshit meter, to be honest. And so she's kind of like, has plenty of righteous indignation at some of the behavior, sometimes from artists who make really bad decisions in a moment of greed or something, and other times from other dealers or collectors. I mean, it was not the 50% kind of deal that has become the norm now. It's like she's making centimes on these sales.
She's making like 10%.
10%.
And then they were ripping her off that. She was like, I was gonna make a whole 10%, and they didn't even give it to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because you have to think about the other galleries that were operating then, and they were showing the old white guys, they were showing the Impressionists, and she knew them, and she talks about also how, the other thing that was quite remarkable is that she convinces her parents and moves in above the shop. So she's living on her own as a single woman in Paris at the turn of the century, which was pretty unusual. But she talks about how Degas would cross the street when he saw her because she was Jewish and he was such an anti-Semite.
Well, all because she did a show for Dreyfus.
Pro Dreyfus.
And he got really, so you really, I mean, that she doesn't talk about, how tough it is for her being poor or for being a woman, and also even for Jewishness. A lot of that's really underplayed, but it's like constant. Like, you can't read it as a contemporary reader and not go like, damn, that's so messed up.
No, it was class, and as well, absolutely class, where the male dealers were, they were all from these wealthy families, and you just felt it, and it was just the chauvinism is, of course, there's still tons of chauvinism today, sadly. But you really feel these kind of three things: the anti-Semitism, the chauvinism, and then the just simple class division. And so as a result, it was always as if she was having to reinvent herself. Artists would leave her, so she would have to start all over again. It was a constant kind of bric-a-brac. And then there's one moment where she finally gets this a larger gallery. And she feels overwhelmed and diminutive. She's standing in this large gallery, and it's not as though she deserves it. She actually is overwhelmed by it, and so kind of my own heart kind of kept going out to her as I was reading.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting thing that so as I mentioned, Marianne de Mervon, who did her PhD dissertation, had to fight chauvinism in France. To her PhD advisor, who kept referring to Berthe as a brocante, as a second-hand dealer, of lesser antiques, not even an antique dealer, but brocante. So, but she went around, and unfortunately, there were no archives. So, without Marianne's scholarship, we wouldn't have been able to do this show. But she went and was able to pick up all the catalogs that Berthe had published from the sidewalk vendors and from the bookstores and from the flea markets. She now has almost all the complete catalogs, which is pretty amazing, and all the invitations. And so it's very funny too, because Berthe decides at one point to publish her own journal, which we see a lot of the contemporary galleries imitating now, creating their own magazines. And first, she gets more brazen as she gets older. First, she invites people to write, and then she signs with it. She's written herself, but signs with somebody else's initials, and then she starts acknowledging that she's writing them herself, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know any of the writers, but that's right. You can hear me. It was always kind of interesting to see, you know, as somebody who writes, it's always interesting to see what people who commission the writers think of them. She's got pretty funny things, like, oh, kind of brilliant but stupid, or whatever, you know, a slapdash way of describing it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the kind of really remarkable moments is at the end where she shows the Modigliani nudes, and she's very kind of casual about the police commissioner who comes across the street and says, "Madame, you have to take these down," and she says, "Well, what?" And you know, she's kind of coy about it, but it's kind of a disaster. And I also felt bad that she couldn't afford to buy one of these Modiglianis, because she feared, you know, she clearly was incredibly proud to make this exhibition. And
the show had to close during the opening.
Yeah.
And they carried out the paintings. She kept trying to divert them and to get them to go someplace else, but they insisted, and they, as she says, it was really terrible for Modigliani himself because he didn't get any sales.
Yeah.
And he later commits suicide, you know, a year later, and part of it is the fact that he was so impoverished and an alcoholic.
Yeah, she actually had put them in the window. That was the other thing, that they were hung. Two of them were hung outside her window. I thought that was an amazing kind of description of that exhibition.
Yeah, and Carlo mentioned the fact that, as I said, she did a lot of these drawings from the various magazines, and there's so many of them. I mean, the one thing I also want to give a shout out to William Rodamore, the translator, who has previously won an Albertine for a French award from the French Cultural Services for his translation. And his introduction is wrestling with they. He talked about how difficult her language was. So this is a woman, and we have to remember this, who probably did not go to school beyond the age of 10 or 12 because public education was just not available for women. So she's really a self-taught person, and she loves books, and she reads a ton of things. And as both Carlo and Jeanne have affirmed, I mean, this is, you know, dealers and writers and artists love books. They want to collect as many as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, so my father is a self-taught dealer. He actually went to Paris, and during the Berlin crisis, and he met an art dealer of Impressionism, and this art dealer kind of took him under his belt, and he had no education whatsoever, and as a result, he now has, you know, miles and miles and miles of art books. And I remember as a young adult, when I would grab, you know, he had the best kind of Warhol, every single Warhol catalog ever, and I would grab one to read or to work with or bring to my bedroom from his gallery, and he always noticed. And so it's this, you know, and you really feel that obsession with books. And actually right now, because I have this new partnership where I'm in the process of making a book plate for all of my books, so that my books are all kind of cataloged, and each will have a book plate in it. So that was it was wonderful to read this kind of constant repetition.
I mean, another thing that I think resonates with today's art world, some things stayed the same, some things are very different. but she would, over the summer vacations, close up her shop for a month or so, and then often visit her artists that she was showing, who had country residences or had places or moved outside the city. And she talks about, in order to finance these trips, she took along some antiques, and she would try to hawk them to pay for the next train trip when she needed to get from one place to another. So, you know, it's just so much, it's so funny to think about the parallels. And then, of course, all the parties and the vernissages where people get too drunk, or the food's really bad. You know, it's like, this was the worst dinner ever. I don't know why, you know, so-and-so chose this restaurant.
But you get a sense in that she's not the party person on the scene. It's like the parties seem to be, you know, really special occasions, and then she does seem to like kind of walk away from them because everyone's just too messed up to talk to anymore. But I do love that, you know, just to think about the autodidact aspect of her, you know, her whole practice. And it reminds me of what I think we sometimes need to be reminded of, is like that the art world's really good when it doesn't rely on professionalism. That actually, like as a, you know, I think we all remember times where it was people who just by their kind of their passions and their guts and the strength of their advocacy who actually carried the day, and that we've allowed every aspect of it to be really professionalized and doesn't leave as much space for people like Berthe.
I mean, the other interesting thing I think we learn about the art scene in Paris is, one, the auctions were very active, and so that's something that's similar. And so she would talk about buying works, you know, for the secondary market, what we call the secondary market, from these auctions when she could. And that she would also encourage her artists to move on. She didn't expect them to stay with her. She knew that a lot of them would move on to better financed and bigger galleries. But at the same time, they would all agree to participate once or twice in the annual thematic exhibition that she started holding over the summer. So it's nice to see that they did remain friends. I mean, Picasso would continue to send her occasionally works to sell so that she would have it, but she was dedicated, as we said numerous times, to les jeunes, of what we would call now emerging artists. And so that continually needs to move ahead. They need to have a new crop of younger artists that she could represent.
But she's also really incredibly loyal to her artists. So there are betrayals for sure, but what you also see is that she's really loyal to the women artists because they're not getting picked up and made famous and selling for big prices. So, and it's really, you know, she never once brings up their gender as why they're not being successful that I remember. It's not like what she dwells on. She just talks about how they're really good artists, you know? And so it makes it really intriguing, especially now that a lot of, you know, especially the museums, everyone's trying to catch up for, I mean, that's one of the things you gotta love about the art world. They always kind of get it wrong. So they spend all this time trying to rectify all the horrible mistakes they've made. So it's sort of like a kind of pretty good guidebook for some pretty forgotten figures, no doubt.
Maybe we can open up for some questions. Yes?
Sorry, I just couldn't squeeze. But it seems like she came from a very humble background, and so I'm very curious as to how she could go from this humble background with basically working class parents to wanting to promote artists in this way. How did that transition occur?
I think the transition occurred because she was apprenticed at such a young age, at age 15, with Salvatore Mayer. And he was clearly a figure who really, really loved talking about art. And he would welcome anybody into the shop. So it was, again, antiques and art, but so it was by hook and crook and sheer determination. So first she gets Madame Mayer to lend her money to open the first shop. And they're very, very, very small shops. I mean, you know, teeny. Then there's a whole passage, it's very funny, where she gets her parents to give her her dowry. so to finance it, and they are not happy. You know, that she says, you can see she uses this expression translated into English as butter the spinach. She's putting, you know, butter on the spinach when she goes over something, or spends too much. But it's because she had this incredible will to make things happen that she succeeds. You know, it seems to be, and periodically there is the struggle to make the rent. You know.
But the artists also related to her. That many of the artists that she worked with were also struggling. And I mean, there's a moment where she's talking about visiting an artist in the summertime, and she arrives to the house and there's nothing to eat, and so she goes out and gets some eggs and, you know, gets them lunch, and you know, it's her milieu at the time. In fact, I think one of the issues is that she was uncomfortable with kind of wealth. She was uncomfortable with it. It wasn't something that she upgraded to, and she, you know, so.
Yeah, and then she talks about at one point the Bernheim-Jeanne brothers
Yes.
coming in a, you know, Rolls Royce
Yeah.
to the gallery, and how they immediately dismiss something she's showing them. I think it may be Toulouse-Lautrec.
Yeah.
She mentions, you know, she's very happy to sell prints and posters by Lautrec because he's not appreciated.
Yeah.
You know, he hasn't received the recognition that he's due.
And even the way she hangs art, you know, there's one comment where somebody gets on the floor to look down because she has it hung very low. I mean, there are all of these kind of these moments in the book where you can see she can't get out of her bric-a-brac kind of mentality, and so that, you know, that's kind of where her comfort level is.
Yeah, and there's, you know, also she's offered some major works to sell, but she doesn't have the funds to be able to purchase them and hold on to them till the right buyer comes along, and she has to return them.
Yeah, but somebody gives her 2 hours.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. They're pretty rough deals,
Yeah,
but
they're
also,
rough. They're rough on her.
I mean, there is like kind of the other way you could say she's not unlike the peer group of artists she's working with, is there's, you know, she's got plenty of self-recriminating material in here where it's just like the folly, you know, it's just like, and I finally had some money and I was feeling rich, and
I went out and spent it all on
and it
theater
was all gone.
tickets.
So it's basically that's it. So you know, you do have also that thing, which is very much, we all know people like that if we're not that way ourselves.
Yeah, and this is something she does mention, that apparently her mother, even though she was a seamstress, loved the theater, and whenever the family had any money, they would go to the theater. And so there was that kind of underpinning. And then the other thing that's really interesting is to see the salon, you know, the various Salon d'automne, the Salon des Jeunes Peintures. You know, this is where artists were showing at that time, because there were a number of galleries, but not that many, you know, considering how much the business has expanded since then. So she would go to these big, you know, group exhibitions and look for young artists, look for artists to pick up.
It's like the Whitney Biennial.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's also tied into the academy.
Yes.
It's
But
a similar model taken from the academic system. It's
Yes,
outside of it.
but it's a jury system, and you didn't have to be a member of the academy to get in, like the Salon d'automne. Yes?
Yes, thank you. This is fascinating. Did she make any particular efforts to go after the American market?
No, not at all. And this is another interesting thing that we've learned from the archives that have been assembled. So it turns out that one of her clients in the 20s and 30s is a fellow named Carter Harrison, who's a former mayor of Chicago. And he actually writes a letter where he's describing Paul Donloy, because he's read it. He buys about 20 or 30 works that are now in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago that he donated. A lot of Utrillo and Pasquin and those more, the École de Paris artists. And she does show a lot of foreign artists. So she's open. I think as far as I know, the only two Americans she showed were Meta Warrick, who becomes well known in the Harlem Renaissance, who was in her very first show, and Samuel Halpert. So it's interesting that she doesn't, show more American artists, but I think they were probably at the better known galleries and not so quote unquote emerging.
Nor did she have great patrons?
No.
American patrons.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I was always wondering what her relationship was with Gertrude Stein.
She doesn't mention her.
She does mention her twice. Yeah, she mentions her. She mentions that she tells Gertrude and Leo to buy Matisse, but they don't listen. And they buy it later from Vollard at higher prices. So that's the one mention. And Gertrude writes in 1933 in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas that everybody showed works. Anybody who was anybody had sold their first pictures at their Vase gallery. And she was recognized by the critics at the time. So I'll mention briefly, and then I think we'll see if there's any more questions so we can go to the signing. But one reason I think she had this major competition with Vollard. And because of her background working with Salvatore Maier, one of the major collectors who collected Impressionist art was a fellow named Isaac de Camondo, who was of the Camondo family. Some of you might know the Musée Nissim de Camondo. And Isaac bought a lot of Impressionist works. And when I was going into the archives at the Musée Nissim de Camondo, there were all the original receipts from all of these amazing paintings. And he bought some really spectacular works, like Manet's Pfeiffer, a lot of Degas, Degas' laundresses, some really iconic works. He donates, Isaac de Camondo donates I think over 100 or 200 works of art to the Louvre. And it's a big quandary for the Louvre because up until that point, they would only accept works by living artists. And he also, his bequest funds the creation of 50 Camondo rooms at the Louvre that were kept up for 50 years. So the furniture he collected, the Japanese art he collected, because of course Japanese art was all the rage at the time. So he dies in 1911, and the Louvre does take the works, even though there had been this controversy. In 1916, 5 years later, Vollard, again, a major dealer of the time, writes a very negative profile of Isaac de Camondo in Mercure de France, one of the leading newspapers, and portrays him as kind of this bumbling doofus who couldn't tell a Renoir from this and doesn't really know what he's buying and doesn't know much at all. And Berthe is outraged because she knew both Isaac. Isaac had not been a client. He was collecting Impressionists, and for her, those were the old white guys. She was focused on emerging artists. But she's infuriated, so she goes to Mercure de France and she writes about this. This originally appeared in the front of her memoir, and one of the decisions I took as an editor was to put it in the back as an appendix, because it's really bizarre when you read it. But she goes to Mercure de France and says, I want to write a rebuttal. And they say, you can't, because that, then Vollard can sue us for slander. So she said, oh, you can malign the dead, but you can't come back at them. So she publishes her own tract that takes down Vollard, and she calls it, in very strange titles, Les Débuts de Dolichos. I can't tell you how many times I've tried reading this part. It's a challenge to read. She drops a lot of names, and she drops over 500 names in the book. And one of the things that William Rodamar did that was so smart was to create a glossary of all the names. So we have one-line biographies of all the various characters that come through. So anyway, she publishes this, and we're not sure what the response was in 1916, but she doesn't give up. She republishes it in 1933 at the very front of her memoir. Les Débuts de la Licoche, she has an explanation. She says, well, you know, Villar and I haven't always gone along so well, but you know, he can take it. But he doesn't. He writes his memoirs, again, Recollections of a Picture Dealer, 3 years later, in his revenge, not to mention her name. So that's where the writing out begins, and that's why we don't know her name, but we know Vollard, Bernard, Jeanne, Rosenberg, and so forth. So, you know, there are just so many interesting ways of looking at this amazing figure who, she also commissions a very strange foreword by Paul Rubu. I don't know if either of you read it at the back. Yeah. It's around, come around children, sit at my, you know, feet and I'll tell you this story. And he's intentionally is telling how the French public did not keep up with the avant-garde art of the time, how, you know, they didn't understand at the time the Impressionists, but that there was this wealth of art. So I encourage you to buy it. It's fun reading, give it as gifts. Jeannie, any other comments, or Carlo?
I'll just say thank you, and thank you, Lynn, and thanks everyone for coming. It's a great book. It's really fun.
Any other questions?
And I want to see the show.
All right. Oh, good.
I want to see the show.
Julie. The title? Pow, right in the eye, 30 years behind the scenes of modern French painting. In French, it's Pan, P-A-N with an exclamation point. We spent hours trying to figure out how to translate it. Pan is the sound that they use if they're saying bang, bang. But you can see, or in the copy, you can see that somebody's shooting, you know, some paint or flipping paint in the eye. So in the introduction, I say it's essentially like the shock of the new. And pendant les 30 ans dans les coulisses de la peinture contemporaine. So peinture painting was considered art. And it was contemporary art. So she's saying 30 years behind the scenes of French art scene, you know, the French art world. Yes?
I'm a good friend with Marianne Rohatyn. I just want to emphasize that if it weren't for her passion, that really matches, I think, there's passion, we wouldn't be sitting here today discussing her, because she really started with nothing.
So this is a shout out again for Marianne Lemervant, who is the French scholar who did her PhD dissertation, and we couldn't do the show without Marianne either.
So it's a one. She also organized, well, she didn't organize it, but there's a small Berthe Weill garden also now, very close to the Picasso.
She did, she got.
She rallied to have.
Yes, when you next go to Paris and visit the Picasso Museum, she waged a public campaign to name the pocket park immediately adjacent, a tiny little square, the Place Berthe Weill. And she also got a sign on the first gallery's location. And she has been a tireless champion, and as I said, amassed a major archive. And without Marianne's this pioneering work, we wouldn't be able to, you know, to do it. So I think she is very happy that it's finally published in English. And I should say that the French version, if any of you want to read the French version aside the English translation, she has put up the French version on her website, which is, you know, Berthe, I think it's .com or archives. You can find it very easily. And there's the original French, and you can see how challenging it was to translate this. And I know that William Rodamar spoke a lot with Marianne, trying to tease out how to translate things that are, you know, jokes are very hard to translate. You know, just. Lucy, you had a question?
Oh yes, it's about Rivera. I noticed that early on, one of your early slides in the top was Diego Rivera, and she must have met him when he was living in Paris.
Yes.
As a young
Oh yeah, no, she had a whole solo exhibition of his work, and it's actually a funny story too, because Diego Rivera and Picasso were having a little bit of a, competition between the two of them, and I think Diego Rivera really wanted to be a maître, the master, and so she ends up writing, I think, an introduction for the catalog, but it's an important exhibition, and she talks about the challenge, and Jeanne and Carlo can attest to this, egos can vary enormously amongst artists. And so these were two egos that were facing off.
There's another artist that she repeats over and over again that that goes through her hands, which is Rohatyn. And I always, every time she seemed to really love his work, and every time she got to handle a work of his, she was just, tickled by it. She really loved this work, and so it's one of the kind of consistent artists that she has her hand.
And,
Yeah.
and she was selling the prints more than the paintings, right?
Yes.
Which is a
It
different-
works on paper, the
Yeah.
pastels,
Yeah.
the drawings.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a funny episode at the beginning, also just when they're starting out, when she's still with her brother, that she unintentionally buys a bunch of forgeries.
Yes.
And has to go to court, and has to then figure out the ins and outs and how to avoid forgeries and make sure of provenance.
Yeah, she first hides them in the closet.
Yeah.
And then they come and confiscate them.
Yeah. And she
It's her first lesson.
she tells the judge, "Don't worry, I've learned my lesson. This is And it was an artist that nobody knows today, Henri Matisse, but apparently he was very popular. And you also get some remarks from her like saying, "So and so is selling like hotcakes. I have no idea why." Yes, one more in the back.
Did she survive the war?
We don't know. It's another of the mysteries, just like her personal life. It seemed that first Marianne Lemarvand had thought that perhaps she went to the countryside and stayed at Emily Charmy's place. But now I think Marianne thinks that she was in a sense hiding in plain sight, that she just hunkered down in her apartment, was very quiet, and somehow manages to avoid, in 41, just before the occupation, she hands over the title of the gallery to a friend, an Aryan friend, because all galleries had to be Aryanized. And so it seems that she was just incredibly lucky. Marianne does point out that a number of her artists weren't so lucky and ended up in the camps. But she managed not to be interned in Vichy, Drancy, and managed to avoid being deported.
And her World War I stories are really great. I mean, it's really like you really get the sense on the ground, because you don't always have that kind of people just remembering what it's like during the war and how many young artists were dying. So there's a lot of real pathos in that section.
Yeah, that section is very painful. She talks about, the bombings and Big Berthe, the guns, and, all the artists who lost their lives. And she comes up with this idea that Jeanne mentioned earlier of selling artist postcards. She thinks that might be a great way to raise funds, and it's a terrible flop. Yes. All right, well, thank you very much.